Chapter 25 of Harvests, Part 2.
Saber?
Rainbow called out as she stepped into the navigation room.
You in here?
Sea Saber and Flintlock looked up from where they were standing around the map table. At the far end of the room, Sunfeather, who was busy with a wrench in front of an open panel in the wall, glanced back before returning to her work. Saber cocked her head.
How did you get back on my ship?
Rainbow blinked.
Huh?
I left you on the tower.
Saber stood, walking around the table and up to Rainbow, eyes narrowing.
How did you get here? Did you leave your armor behind and fly?
Her frown tightened.
That armor is very expensive.
What? No.
Rainbow shook her head, confused by the sudden questioning.
Twilight teleported me and AJ up once she got back from her meeting.
She looked to Flint, eyes widening as she saw his expression.
Wait. Saber, were you actually going to leave us? What about Luna?
Saber pursed her lips.
I told you we were leaving.
And you weren't gonna come back?
I planned on checking on you today after you'd had some time to think about whether or not you want to follow orders, but it seems no matter how hard I try to discipline you, you'll always find a way to do whatever you want.
Saber turned away, stalking back towards the map table with a frustrated flick of her tail.
What? We could have been dead.
Rainbow trotted after her.
You said you didn't trust those ponies.
Yes, you could have been dead.
Saber rounded on her with a sharp snarl.
I'm glad you finally caught up to my thought process a whole day later.
Rainbow gaped back, shocked by the sudden outburst.
You listen to me very closely because you have done a very good job of putting me into a very tight situation ever since I pulled you out of that damn cocoon.
Saber jabbed a hoof into Rainbow's chest, making her flinch.
I don't want to be here. I don't want my ponies here. The only reason we are here and not getting comfortable with a new contract in Baltimore is because my crew has convinced me to let them risk it. Now, I know you're smart enough to understand that, which is why I'd think you'd be smart enough to show some sky's damned gratitude and listen to me!
Rainbow licked her lips, opening her mouth to utter an apology, but Saber silenced her with a fierce glare.
I'm done with it. I am telling you, right here and now, if you disobey me again, if you so much as question an order in the field, I'm leaving. I'll take your princess with me and sell her to the highest bidder, and the only time I'll think of you again is when you haunt me in my nightmares.
Rainbow hadn't realized until then, but she had actually started to cringe back under Saber's tirade, leaving the other mare to lean over her with lips curled back into a snarl. She waited a few seconds, making sure Saber was done, before gingerly stepping back and straightening up.
Yes, ma'am.
She cleared her throat, looking down.
I understand.
I sure hope so,
Saber growled, though some of the heat left her voice.
Now, what did you want to see me for?
Rainbow frowned, momentarily confused until she remembered that she hadn't been looking for Saber just to get chewed out.
I just wanted to let you know I was heading out. I mean, if that's all right with you?
She added hastily. The corner of Saber's lips twitched up before she turned back to the map table.
I'm glad you asked. I have no plans for you as of now, so you're free to go. What are you doing?
Well,
Rainbow grinned sheepishly, hoping that Saber wouldn't think she was going mad.
The Crystal Ponies invited me to join them on a hunt, and I thought I'd go along.
Ah, a hunt? Flint arched a brow. You turning into a griffin now? Saber looked up from the map table, narrowing her eyes.
Explain.
It's kinda complicated,
Rainbow shrugged.
but I guess the quickest way to sum it up is that the Crystal Ponies think Twilight is blessed by their god or something, and they want to hold this big ceremony for her, and for that they need to have a big hunt and a big feast. And Twilight wants us to try and learn more about these ponies, so I figured going along with them should help with that, right?
Saber blinked. She exchanged a glance with Flintlock, who offered up a quiet grunt.
Applejack is aboard, right?
Rainbow nodded.
She's in the cargo hold, I think.
I'll debrief her for details.
Saber was already making for the door to the rest of the ship. The door parted with hissing steam, and she paused to glance back over her shoulder.
Be back by sunset.
The door hissed closed, leaving the room quiet but for the ticking of the gears. Rainbow looked to Flint. What are you looking at me for, Huntress? He nodded to the door. You ain't got all day. Rainbow rolled her eyes before following Saber out the door. The other Pegasus was nowhere to be seen, so she walked down the stairs to the lower level and to one of the side hatches in silence. The sun was low on the horizon when Rainbow stepped out into the open air and let the wind catch her. The Argo was hovering a short distance above one of the rocky islands that ringed the smooth ice around the Crystal Empire, and Rainbow glided down the slope at a leisurely pace, stirring up swirling eddies of snow with her wing beats that tickled at her hoof tips. She pumped her wings, feeling the weight of the blades nestled among her feathers, and skimmed low over the surface of the ice. She'd caught glimpses of the Crystal Ponies' airships before, once from afar when she first spotted the city, and a second time as silhouettes during the snowstorm that was going on at their arrival. But this was the first time she had seen them up close in clear weather. There were two ships, one still moored and loading passengers while the other floated slow circles around the city. Rainbow aimed herself towards the latter, enjoying the burn in her flight muscles as she climbed. It almost looked like a ship built around another ship. At the center was a hull of sleek, inky black crystal, slim and angled to cut effortlessly through the air with the slanted edge of its prow. It curved gently outward towards the center, where an upper deck rose seamlessly out of the lower. And then there was the rest of the ship. A railing of bone had been erected around the otherwise totally featureless lower deck, and rope bridges hanging from either side allowed crew to get between the bow and stern without having to climb up and over the cluttered upper deck. Ropes were wrapped around almost every part of the ship, sleeved with leather where the sharp edges of the crystal might fray or cut, giving grips to traverse with and anchors for supplies to be tied down to. Netting hung loose at the sides for ponies to climb aboard, and platforms of hide and bone were erected all around the uneven upper deck, providing space for ponies to stand. The whole ship was suspended from a long, slender envelope that looked to be made of furry hide stitched together and supported by the bleached ribcage of some huge creature. An odd purple smoke drifted from the small flaps in the envelope, angry and thick, holding together longer than Rainbow would have expected before finally being torn apart by the strong northern wind. In place of any propellers, the ship had an angled sail extending from its stern, like a fishtail, with a few smaller sails placed to either side. Rainbow could already see over a dozen ponies clothed in heavy fur cloaks busying themselves about the deck, tying knots and conversing among themselves as they organized supplies. She would never admit it, but the sight sent a chill down her spine. Aside from the strange crystal hull, almost every part of the ship, even down to the clothes of its crew, was built with material harvested from the dead. But she steeled herself, determined not to be cowed by the grisly outward appearances. One of her best friends was a slit-eyed fanged predator after all, and she knew Twilight wanted her to give these ponies a chance.
Good thing they're all so polite,
She thought.
They've been nicer to me than most of the other ponies I've met in this new Equestria.
She landed gently on the rear lower deck, straightening up defiantly as several ponies glanced in her direction. They weren't like the young children and elders she and Applejack had spoken with inside the tower yesterday. These ponies were rough around the edges, their fur as coarse and scarred as the thick hides they wore around their shoulders. There was a moment where the chatter around the deck stilled. Rainbow set her jaw, silently daring them to challenge her. A stallion stepped forward, his dark fur cloak accented with a fuzzy white hood. His face was a pale gray that appeared almost marbled in the sunlight. "You're Rainbow Dash? Chosen Twilight's companion?" Rainbow nodded, tossing her mane.
That's me.
He broke out into a wide, friendly smile. "Good! I am Brucite Bow, Huntmaster of the West Face and Chief of the Crystal Heart. Welcome. We are honored to have you join us for the hunt." Rainbow blinked, momentarily confused as several of the other hunters stepped up to greet her, bowing their heads or slapping her on the back with eager grins.
Thanks?
The greetings didn't last long. The hunters parted quickly, returning to their tasks and leaving Rainbow more or less alone with Bow.
So, nice ship you got here.
Rainbow said stiffly, still recovering from her surprise. She looked up, spotting the banners hanging from the bottom of the envelope depicting a curving red horn on black fabric.
You guys built this all on your own?
No, not us, no. Bo looked up to the banners with reverence. The Crystal Heart and the Flurry Heart were carved by our ancestors during the thawing of the world, guided by the Shaper. They've been with our people since the first stories, giving us means to harvest food and clothes from the ice.
Huh.
Rainbow sat down, taking the ship in with a fresh perspective. Maybe it really was like Twilight had said. Maybe these ponies really were just doing what they had to survive. And if that was the case, who was she to fault them? Even if it was gross.
So, how can I help?
Your appearance is help enough, Bo said, turning his smile back to her. The hunt is dangerous, and it would be a great tragedy if you were to be injured. But we are honored to have chosen Twilight's friend with us, and your presence will bolster our spirits. Rainbow frowned. Even here, on the edge of the world, ponies wanted her to just stand by and watch while they risked her lives? Her lips tightened, and she opened her mouth to protest, to demand that she be allowed to help. But she hesitated. Every time she had been told to stay back, hadn't there ultimately been a good reason? And hadn't she, or the pony she cared about, suffered whenever she tried to force herself into things where she was told she didn't belong? She flexed her wings, thinking of how frustrated Saber had been the last time they spoke.
All right.
She forced a smile, trying to hide her disappointment.
I'll keep back. But if you need anything, you call me in, got it?
Bo dipped into a quick bow. So it shall be, Rainbow Dash. With the Shaper's guidance, we will bring back the makings of a great feast for your friend. Rainbow awkwardly returned the bow before stepping back, and Bo turned away without hesitation, calling out commands. There wasn't much room on the deck. It was narrow enough without the supplies stacked along the center line, so she settled for a spot near the middle, leaning against the strangely warm crystal of the upper deck. She let the hunters work in peace, responding to their friendly smiles with stiff nods. Despite what Bo had said about the hunt being dangerous, the ship almost had a carnival air about it, with everyone chattering excitedly in little groups as they worked. Was every hunt like this, she wondered? Or was it just because of her and her friends showing up? Before long, the other airship, the Flurry Heart, finished its preparations and pulled up beside the Crystal Heart, its crew signaling its readiness for the hunt. Both ships sailed west with the wind behind them, and Rainbow found herself enjoying the trip. She moved to the bow and took a spot next to a younger huntress, who introduced herself as Esmeralda, watching the frozen landscape pass by and listening as she named all the submerged mountain ranges and spoke of the hunt. She told her about the yaks, huge, hairy monsters with horns almost as thick as a pony's chest, and Rainbow realized that the description fit the beast that had nearly drowned her under the ice perfectly. She had never met a yak before the wedding, but she had heard of them. And it suddenly struck Rainbow that whatever apocalypse befell Equestria must have affected the whole rest of the world as well. She wondered what a corrupted griffin might look like, or a zebra. Were there any survivors far beyond equestrian borders, their descendants living on in much the same way as ponies here were? She knew that there were griffin aeries on mountains taller than the Kennerhorn. Maybe Gilda had survived and had chicks, and her descendants were living now on an island that had once been a towering mountain. She found it difficult to focus on such thoughts, however, as Esmeralda then moved on to enthusiastically explain the process of gutting and harvesting a yak carcass, naming all the ways one could use the body. Bone for tools, hide for clothing, fat for burning, and of course, meat for eating. Though apparently yak meat was stringy and tough, unpopular for cooking.
Oh, look!
She said, her ears pricking up.
There they are now.
Rainbow leaned forwards as she followed Esmeralda's hoof. Jutting up out of the ice between two rocky islands was a group of the strange white orbs that she'd seen earlier, just before that yak had attacked her.
Those are yak dens, right? I thought you guys didn't like, eating yak.
She grimaced and glanced over her shoulder, half expecting someone to shoot her an odd look after speaking such a strange sentence.
We don't,
the huntress said.
but the yaks give us more than just their bodies.
Rainbow arched a brow at the cryptic answer, but Esmeralda walked off before she could press for any details. She watched as half the crew began to pair off, taking positions around the chains while the ponies working the rudder and sails began to shout between each other. The deck swayed under hoof as the ship began to turn, losing altitude until it was circling the yak dens low to the ice. She saw the Flurry Heart dipping lower as well, though it kept its distance from the dens. Rainbow had to squint to see the crew scurrying around the deck, though she couldn't make out what they were doing. She cocked her head as a trail of colorful crystal balls, about the size of a pony's head, were thrown from the Flurry Heart's deck. They hit the ice with crunches she could just barely hear from this distance, bouncing along in the ship's wake on thin chains and leaving a path of chipped ice behind them.
What's the point of that?
Rainbow scratched her head, confused. And then the ice suddenly exploded in front of the bouncing weights, right under the Flurry Heart's belly. A huge yak burst out of the spray, roaring and stomping in fury. Rainbow gaped as a second yak broke through the ice an instant later, and then another, and soon there was an entire herd of the monstrous beasts racing across the ice, jumping and snarling in the ship's shadow. "Ha ha! The Shaper is with us today, friends!" Bo shouted merrily over the deck. Rainbow tore her gaze away from the Flurry Heart to see him raising a hoof high from his position next to the ship's wheel. "Let us show our honored guests our bravery!" Whoops of excitement sounded across the deck as ponies began to jump over the edge, the jumpers all tied by rope to a partner that remained on the ship with their legs braced. Rainbow ran to the edge, peering over and saw 6 crystal ponies land heavily on the ice, empty baskets at their sides, before galloping towards the yak dens. They all swarmed around the nearest den, turning and bucking against the thick ice as one. There was a deep crunch, and they kicked again and then again until finally, with a resounding crack, the round ice buckled, exposing the shattered interior. It was impossible to see inside from where she stood, but Rainbow didn't have to wait long. The hunters dove inside with excited shouts, and a few seconds later they began to leap back into the crisp open air, their baskets filled with frozen fish. Each one sprinted for the ship as they emerged, calling to the pony on the deck holding their rope. They would jump as they drew close, pulling themselves up with gritted teeth, until their partner helped them back aboard with grunts of exertion and grins of approval. Rainbow looked back to the Flurry Heart, watching as the crew of the distant ship dropped heavy stones on the pursuing yaks, and it all clicked together. The yaks were predators that hunted under the ice, stashing leftovers and excess in their dens. The Crystal Ponies used one ship to draw them away, and then used the other to get in close, break through the ice, and steal the frozen meat.
Sweet Celestia,
She muttered.
these ponies are crazy.
They weren't even gifted like her. She hadn't seen a single cutie mark among the Crystal Ponies, and they were brave enough to jump off their ship and literally steal food right from a monster's lair. They had to know how dangerous this was. Almost all of the hunters had scars on their faces or long patches in their cloaks from previous wounds. Her eyes widened as she saw a trio of yaks peeling away from the Flurry Heart, angling themselves back towards their dens before bowing their heads and storming across the ice at a full gallop. They had noticed the intruders, and there were still ponies down on the ice. Rainbow flared her wings, watching another hunter scramble out of the den and get hauled up on the deck. But a quick glance around told her that there was still one pony left. The crew shouted warnings as the trio of returning yaks grew closer, one peeling ahead of all the others. Finally, the last pony appeared. Esmeralda nearly tripped as she clambered out of the den with a full sea pony carcass splayed limply over her shoulders. She clenched her jaw as she ran for the ship, but it was obvious she wouldn't make it. The lead yak would be on her in seconds, and although the crew was already running to grab heavy rocks they could throw down to try and defend their comrade, Rainbow doubted it would make any difference. She leapt off the ship almost without thinking. She wasn't going to just sit and watch this pony get gored, even if she barely knew her. And maybe she still had a bit of a grudge from the last time she'd faced one of these things, but well, that was just a bonus. The huntress drew up short as Rainbow snapped her wings open, but Rainbow ushered her on.
Go, go!
She shouted, pouring on speed. She didn't look to see if the mare listened. She could get to the yak in time, but she had to be sure it would chase after her. She extended a wing and pulled off to one side before twisting into a snap turn, slicing across the yak's face barely a hair's breadth from its deadly horns. The yak roared, and she grinned as she felt the warm splash of its blood on her feathers, but she couldn't relax just yet. There was still two others to contend with, and if she flew to safety too soon, then the beast might turn back to the easier prey. She spared a glance toward Esmeralda and saw that she had reached the ship, but it seemed she couldn't climb up with the weight of the sea pony on her back. More ponies were rushing to grab her up and help pull her up. But in the meantime, Rainbow would have to keep stalling.
Hey, ugly! Haven't you ever heard of a haircut?
Rainbow banged towards the axe once more. The lead one dug its claws in and chased after her, but the two further back didn't seem to have noticed her yet. She whistled to catch their attention before landing on one of their backs, taking care not to get her hooves tangled in its thick hairs. The yak skidded to a stop, leaving a deep gouge in the ice behind it and reared up, trying to buck her off. Rainbow held firm, shifting her weight and using her wings for balance, and grinned as she saw the lead yak still barreling towards her, head down. There was a wet crunch, and the yak under Rainbow's hooves wheezed as its gut was opened by the horns of its kin. She jumped off with a whoop, watching the surviving yak struggle to free its horns, only for her grin to falter when she realized that there was still one yak missing. A mare's scream drew her attention. She whirled midair, gasping as she saw Esmeralda clinging desperately to the rope, still keeping the sea pony balanced on her shoulders even as blood gushed from a fresh wound on her leg. The last yak skidded to a stop, its horns glistening with blood, and turned to line up for another charge. That's when Rainbow saw it, a flash of bright rainbow hair, tangled up and stained red around one of the yak's horns. Rainbow snarled, fire rising in her chest.
for more, huh?
She growled under her breath, coiling her body like a spring.
I'll teach you to mess with Rainbow Dash!
She surged into motion, mist swirling to either side of her rainbow contrail. The axe head jerked towards her as she closed in, but it wasn't quick enough to react. She turned and crashed into its forehead with both hind legs, the hard edges of her hooves connecting with its skull with a sickening crack. The axe stumbled back, but kept its balance. Rainbow bounced away, spinning once before landing on the ice and flaring her wings. Rainbow Dash! Esmeralda is safe! Bo shouted down from the deck. Come back! Rainbow ignored him, keeping her eye locked on the axe's beady glare. It had gotten the jump on her last time, but now they were face to face. She wasn't going to run from it a second time.
Come on. What are you waiting for?
Rainbow took a quick step forwards, trying to goad the beast into charging her, but it only snorted and lowered its stance. She narrowed her eye, flexing her wings.
Does it remember me?
Well, if it was afraid to make the first move, then she'd gladly strike first. She leapt into the air, arcing towards the axe's flank, only for it to rush backwards, turning its head to keep its huge horns pointed in her direction. She grimaced and tried for another angle, but the axe never let its eyes off her, bellowing and brandishing its horns every time she tried to dart into strike. Rainbow drew up short, hovering in front of it with a snarl.
What are you so afraid of? Coming! Whoa!
The axe charged without warning, forcing Rainbow to awkwardly flutter out of its way. It pivoted quickly, rushing her a second time while she was still off balance, and Rainbow was forced to tuck her wings in and drop to avoid its horns. She smacked into the ice with a grunt, wincing as the axe shadow passed over her. It pivoted again, rearing up over her, lifting its head to roar triumphantly as it prepared to stomp her skull in with hooves that could break through ice as thick as a pony. Time seemed to slow down. Rainbow could hear the Crystal Pony shouting something from the ship, but that was the last thing on her mind. She saw every part of the yak in crisp detail. The thick, coarse fur, the long hairs that hung down all around its face like a curtain, the cloven hooves, each toe tapering into a blunt claw, and a small line of pale, exposed skin just under its jaw. Rainbow screamed, throwing her weight to one side. The axe hooves crashed down on either side of her head with sharp cracks that made her ears ring. And the pointed tips of Rainbow's wing blades sunk into its throat. Thick, black blood splattered onto Rainbow's face, dripping down into her mouth. She coughed and looked away, only for a fresh, even stronger spurt to slam into her. The yak gurgled above her, its legs going weak, and Rainbow's eye widened as the weight on her wings began to grow.
Oh, hey!
Rainbow lifted her hooves to try and shift the huge thing off of her, but it was heavy. Even with most of its body already limp on the ice, she could just barely keep her legs from buckling under the weight of its upper body. And it wouldn't stop bleeding on her.
Anyone there? Help!
She blinked as the axe suddenly rolled to one side, landing on the ice beside her with a dull thud. 4 hunters looked down at her with wide smiles, haloed by the sun. Oh, Rainbow Dash! Bo laughed, bending down and hauling her to her hooves. You truly do honor us.
What?
Rainbow looked around with a tentative smile as the other 3 Crystal Ponies all clapped her on the back excitedly. Some even sloughing yak blood off her face before painting it onto their cheeks. She hadn't really been thinking about how they'd react to her risking her life and ignoring the order to come back to the ship. But after all of her past experiences with Sea Saber, approval had been at the bottom of the list. Killing a yak in lone battle. Bo exchanged smiles with the other hunters, who were already taking positions at either side of the beast's carcass. Such courage hasn't been displayed in 2 generations. Rainbow's smile grew into a grin as her unease was quickly overtaken by pride. She straightened up, striking a pose.
I am pretty awesome, yeah. Good to finally get some recognition for it.
And as reward for your bravery, Bo continued, crouching by the axe front and pulling a knife out from under his cloak, you may have its heart. Rainbow stiffened at the sound of a knife piercing flesh.
Wait, what?
Her eyes shot wide open as she turned and saw Bo digging around in the axe chest. The other 3 hunters busied themselves tying rope around its legs as he straightened up, a bloody, black organ still pumping in his hooves. Bile rose in the back of her throat, and her muzzle scrunched up in disgust as he presented the yak heart to her with an encouraging nod.
You want me to eat that?
He nodded again, and Rainbow noticed the other hunters had stopped to watch. Normally, we would share the heart among the hunters, but when a pony takes down a yak on their own, it belongs to them. He bowed his head, holding the heart higher. To eat the heart of a yak is to take its strength for yourself. It is your honor as a yak slayer. Rainbow blanched.
But, I mean, won't I get sick?
Bo looked up with a frown, cocking his head, and for a moment Rainbow thought she had offended him. But then his eyes lit up and the smile came back, and he shook his head good-naturedly. I'm sorry. I had forgotten that equestrians don't eat meat. You may feel ill, yes, but the heart will not hurt you. All of our children must learn to eat meat as they grow. Her uncertainty must have been obvious, because he added, We understand if you turn it down, and we will not be offended. We merely wish to give you what you deserve. Rainbow pursed her lips, watching as the heart squirmed in his hooves. It looked and smelled disgusting, but something held her back from rejecting the offer outright. Was this how Twilight had felt back in Canterlot, when she had first had to eat meat? If what Bo said was true, then it wouldn't hurt to at least try a bite, right? The Crystal Ponies had been nothing but kind to her so far, and she was loath to repay their kindness by turning down what was clearly an important gift from them. Ever since waking up in this twisted, shattered version of Equestria, she felt like she was punished no matter what she did. Every single time she had tried to help, tried to do what she felt in her gut was right, she had been beaten or chastised, lectured by the very pony she was trying to help, or left broken on the floor while her enemies gloated. But not this time. The Crystal Ponies had told her to stay back, but they didn't hold it against her when she jumped in to help. Instead, they thanked her, congratulated her, and even offered her an award of sorts. And as gross as that award was, Rainbow wanted it. Besides, Twilight had eaten meat, right? Was Rainbow really going to back down from something that egghead had been brave enough to do? She reached out, taking the heart with bated breath. It was slippery and wet and warm, still pumping, almost as if it had a life of its own. Rainbow grimaced as she looked down at it, watching thick black blood drip from both ends. She kept staring and thinking she'd never work up the courage. But if there was one thing Rainbow was good at, it was not thinking. She closed her eye and leaned in, sinking her teeth into the heart. It was tough, gamey, and she had trouble keeping her grip as she worked her head side to side, struggling to pull a piece free with her flat teeth. Blood pooled in her mouth, strangely tangy, but she had tasted blood before, and it wasn't enough to scare her off. Finally, she pulled her head back, peeling away a stringy bite. She kept her eye closed as she chewed, trying not to think about what she was doing. Her teeth were ill-suited to the task, but the heart was slick with blood, and after working at it in vain for several seconds, she just threw her head back and swallowed the bite whole. She opened her eye and stuck her tongue out, fighting to keep it down. A little voice in the back of her head screamed that she had gone mad, and the bitter aftertaste lingered no matter how much she licked her lips. Bo cheered, and an instant later he was joined by a chorus of other voices. Rainbow looked back and saw the ponies of the Crystal Heart all watching from the deck, stomping their hooves in approval. And she couldn't help but grin back at them. Not too bad, huh, X-Slayer? Bo said, taking the heart back with a wide smile. But do not force yourself further. Let's get back to the ship with your kill, and quick! We'll have a great feast on our return, and there will be stories to tell. Come! Rainbow smiled back, laughing at his contagious enthusiasm. And she kept smiling as she helped the hunters haul the dead yak onto their ship, and smiled wider as every pony on the crew came to congratulate her personally. Her cheeks were starting to hurt when they flew close to the Flurry Heart, and Bo shouted the news of what she had done, spawning a fresh wave of roared approval. But she never stopped smiling. She liked these Crystal Ponies, meat eating and all.